It is about 12:01, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us for today's panel on recruiting and retention in law enforcement, an issue that affects public safety, community trust, and the future of policing nationwide. Departments across the country are facing staffing shortages, increased retirements, and changing expectations from both communities and potential recruits. Today, we'll explore why this is happening, what's working, and what we might do differently moving forward. We're joined by three experts today who bring different complementary perspectives. Dr. Jenna Tyler, research scientist with the University of Virginia's Center for Public Safety and Justice. Dr. Tanya Meisenholder, director of NYU Policing Project with 30 by 30, and Sergeant Mike Boward, Fort Collins, Colorado Police Department. Let's set the landscape and a little bit about why it matters, but some housekeeping. Panelists, feel free to unmute and chime in whenever you want. This is a friendly conversation, not a university lecture. Second, there is a Q&A function. Those in the audience, feel free to use the Q&A and panelists will feel free to answer. Question one, I'll turn to Dr. Jenna Tyler. From a research perspective, how serious is the recruiting and retention challenge in law enforcement right now, and what are the broader impacts on police departments and communities?
Thanks, William. So the recruiting and retention challenge in law enforcement is certainly serious, sustained, and is affecting most agencies across the country. In fact, a recent survey by IACP revealed that most agencies report hiring is much harder now than it was 5 years ago, and many are operating with a roughly 10% staffing gap. So this really suggests it's not just a temporary fluctuation, but a structural problem affecting multiple agencies of different sizes and across different regions. And I think when it comes to the broader impacts of the recruitment and retention problem, I think we can think about it in kind of at the individual, the organizational, and the community level. Certainly at the individual level, chronic understaffing can increase the need for overtime. It can accelerate burnout and fatigue, which in turn can sometimes lead to poor officer decision-making. Organizationally, agencies can be forced to reallocate resources away from more proactive or specialized work and dedicate those resources to more basic demands. And at the community level, these staffing pressures can really translate into slower response times or fewer opportunities to build positive relationships with their community members, which that can always lead to, potentially deteriorating perceptions of police legitimacy and trust.
Thank you. That kind of reminds me of a few conversations we had last year at the Restoring the Ranks conference. As a slight follow-up, what kind of strategies are agencies currently using to improve recruitment and retention?
Yeah, absolutely. So we learned from the Center's Restoring the Ranks conference this past October, which brought together about 80 participants from 31 major law enforcement agencies, that agencies are using several tactics to improve their recruitment and retention. And I think these can largely be organized into about 4 categories. The first would be improving the application process. So we've heard from several agencies that they are doing things to simplify their forms, to reorder the application steps, to use automation to improve their steps, and also sending personalized reminder emails and texts to really kind of emphasize positive and affirming language. The second area we heard from is the use of digital advertisements and social media. I think many agencies are likely engaging in this, reporting that they're developing targeted digital ads, producing short recruitment videos featuring real officers, conducting outreach to schools and community partners, and launching reactivation campaigns for prior applicants. Third area I think we heard about at the conference is really trying to attract more qualified applicants through messaging. So emphasizing community service themes such as fairness, respect, and engagement, describing some of the personal and professional benefits of police work, and also just trying to humanize the policing as a profession through more story-driven content and realistic previews of the job. And then finally, we heard that agencies are really trying to modernize hiring standards. So this could be updating policies related to residency requirements and even physical appearance. So kind of taken together, we really learned through that conference that many agencies are taking a multi-pronged approach to attract more officers. And unfortunately, implementing several strategies simultaneously can be really hard to figure out which ones are actually leading to improved outcomes, which one's actually working in that regard. And so I think, coming at it from a research perspective, that's really where I find a lot of interest is really to try to figure out which of these strategies is leading to not only having more officers, but having higher quality officers.
That's amazing. Thanks, Jenna. Sergeant Boward, turning to you. From inside a department, how do recruiting and retention challenges show up in a day-to-day operational front?
Yeah, no, again, thank you for, I'm honored to be on this talk, especially with such esteemed co-presenters. So, this is a passion of mine and I know others of, what we're looking for. And to answer your question, I mean, it's really all over the place, that impact. It's easy to look at, okay, we don't have enough people to staff a shift. But then, of course, there's all kinds of effects from that. Overtime rises, your service, quality goes down. And, quite frankly, if you're, just like Jenna was saying, there's a lot of strategies to attract people, but at the end of the day, we all want quality candidates. And we've always believed in the concept of higher character trained skills. And, if you don't have people with the character that you want, that's then you see that. The other problems with the lack of staffing is the service to the community, because if agencies really get cut down, what does the priorities turn into? It's just responding to calls and maybe not even be able to work them as thoroughly as you would like from that service piece, because that's what we're about, right? We're here to serve the community, and that's where you see those cuts coming into place. So there's a lot of different, both financial with overtime, staffing, and all that, and then just that relationship with the community, because you can't fake that. You have to build that, and that's again from your most junior officer that you have. They're the face of your agency. So those are the big challenges with really, how do we staff, and how do we go, from just looking at just numbers on a board that we have to fill X amount of officers, to making sure that we're doing that in a way that really is getting those people that we want to represent our brand and our agency.
That makes sense. Delving in from a slightly different perspective, we understand kind of the understaffing challenges for community service, but how does it affect existing officers?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great follow-up. I would say wellness is your number one thing that we've seen, because, especially if you're doing forced overtime, or, yeah, sure, money's nice, right? But money is not the fuel that keeps people around long. It's kind of, I've talked about recruiting kind of in that, I forget where I heard it, but it was a good analogy. But you can have your kind of your fast food recruiting, which is high carbs and gives you short-term satisfaction, where you're more kind of holistic diet, long-term strategies to keep people in place. And so I think that's a lot of the things that you notice on that wellness front, is you just get burnout. And then when you look at retention, because obviously it's not all about recruiting, right? It's about keeping quality people in place. And I'll share some things that we've done with our agency to really try to impact, both from our recruiting for bringing our wellness programs into play, and then continuing to develop those. One thing I'll highlight just real briefly is and this came from like the ground level, but we've got a peer support team, like many people do. We have a couple of our own psychologists, but we have voluntary check-ins now twice a year, and people get 10 hours of time off for each check-in. So again, it's not, diagnostic per se, but we get a pretty high take rate with that. And that's a good opportunity then to help our officers who are not only dealing with critical incident stress, but just the day-to-day, work and family things that they have. And we've got some other programs, and there's some other programs I see I'll share later. But I think if you look at that holistic piece of how you're bringing people in, that that's a huge thing to look at, is wellness. So that'd be my answer. Kind of the short. I think wellness is the biggest thing you see.
That's helpful. I mean, I think that really helps set the foundation of where we're going today. And I think, both perspectives really show where we're headed. But we could also talk a little bit about what's working and maybe what isn't. Dr. Tanya Meisenholder, When it comes to attracting candidates today, what strategies have proven most effective and which traditional approaches may not be working as well anymore?
Hi, William. Thanks for the question. I'm happy to be here today with Mike and Jenna and you as well. One thing I would comment on too, I know we're talking about recruitment of sworn police officers primarily, but I do think a lot of what we're talking about applies to our civilian and professional staff workforce as well, especially when you think about crime scene investigators, 911 dispatchers, whatever the case may be. So I say that on the onset. And then I would raise 3 points that will help preface my answer here. One is recruiting today is happening in a much tighter labor market than it was a few decades ago. There are fewer people available, and that means law enforcement is competing more with other industries for the same workers. I would also think about, Mike, I don't know what your vacancy rate is there, but we think about a vacancy rate in individual agency. If you multiply that by the vacancy rate in terms of all of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies across the United States, then you really get a sense of what this staffing challenge looks like in terms of the tens of thousands of vacancies in the United States. And then the last point I would raise is about generational differences and expectations and what people are looking for in a career right now, and whether the expectations are being met with policing. So, what's working? Early, very realistic exposure to the job. So, I'm thinking about ride alongs, I'm thinking about preparation events in terms of physical fitness, college pipelines. Another thing that's really important is clearer timelines, transparency. What's the reality of the schedule and the tour and vacations that you're going to be working? What type of job are you going to be assigned to? Very clear expectations around training, around physical fitness. And to Mike's point, how does support and wellness actually work? This generation in particular is very focused on their physical and mental, needs. And I think that's a turning point for law enforcement. And to the extent that we are answering that up front, it's really critical. I would also add in more frequent communication. This is a generation that has higher rates to some extent around uncertainty and anxiety, and they really want more frequent communication and follow through once candidates are engaged. Messengers are also important, and shorter, more predictable hiring timeframes. So those are the top that I would say in terms of what's working right now is fixing those challenges in an agency.
So can I just add something that you're
Absolutely.
spot on there? You know, and that's something that is so important for those of us that have been around for a while in policing to be able to evolve our thinking. For example, there's a lot of people that want to be detectives or special units and things, and the tendency to say, well, you got to wait your turn, and you got to serve this amount. And we know why that is because, that's a development of skills on patrol. But in phrasing your answer differently, I think is really key. Because if you can explain that and say, hey, it's because you get to build these skills. And like, for example, our department, you can be a patrol CSI. You can do lots of, drone operators, lots of different things that kind of fit the need for folks that, I mean, if you're hiring a high performing people, they should want to do other things, right? And be detectives and so on and so forth. So I think if you can have a realistic conversation about, yes, it might take a, handful of years or whatever, but look at these things you can do in the meantime and really, fill those needs. So I think our old traditional, you just have to wait 5-10 years or whatever. We need to change that in how we talk about things.
That's helpful. Tanya, there's a thread you mentioned that I wanted to pull on just a little bit further. Is not only has the job changed, but the candidate expectations have also changed. You mentioned a few expectations that have changed over the years, but could you delve a little bit further into how the candidates now look at the application process and kind of the job as a whole?
Sure, William. And Mike, I'll comment on what you just said, but this generation in particular is interested in work-life balance, if there is such a thing, in a different way than older generations. They want their vacations, they want their time off. They don't want to do overtime mandatory, over and over again. They're also very open about what they see that works and doesn't work in an agency, or what's right and what's wrong. So I've talked to a few agencies recently who have mentioned that they've seen a higher rate of complaints coming from recruits in the academy. And that to me is a very interesting turning point, because that says that they are more willing to speak up about things that they don't perceive as correct or incorrect. And, Mike, to me, that's a very big cultural issue in terms of what that looks like. And William, I touched on officers' safety and wellness. I think in terms of their own mental health, their physical health, those are much more important. And we know that a lot of folks in this generation are more open to mental health support and wellness and going to see therapists and all of these different things. So I think there's a couple of buckets where the newer generation is coming in. And one thing I would add to that as well is they're not necessarily joining the department with the idea that they're going to stay. Many people in the newer generation, I don't want to say job hop, but for lack of a better term, they might join, and a couple of years later, they're looking to leave and try something else on. So they're not entering policing with the idea that they're going to stay for 20, 30 years. And my last point is to touch on what Mike said. I've talked to at least one agency who started having conversations about career planning with recruits in the academy. So here's your path. You can become a supervisor. You could go, to the detective bureau, but here's the things that you need to do to try and get candidates, or recruits, I should say, to start thinking about that early on. I'm not aware, in my experience, of many agencies that do that. It often comes later as a result of conversations with supervisors and your peers.
Thank you. Sergeant Boward, back to you. Just joining us from Fort Collins, what have you or your department tried that have actually moved the needle in recruiting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the key to remember is it really is the holistic piece, right? You're looking at totality of a person. It's easy to say, oh, we've got a hiring bonus, which we don't, but that can be kind of a fast food piece, when you talk to agencies around the country. It doesn't seem to be the best thing. And I understand some agencies have to do that or comply, but I think if you look at the totality of what you want as an officer, just like the doctor was saying, somebody that can do all these different things, but also is self-reflective enough to say, I do need some balance. Do need things like that. And then we have to meet them with that. So for example, I shared our peer support program, but we've got a lot of different programs like that we do. And we really use that in our recruiting of, appealing to that. We write our recruiting campaigns based on the generational needs. If you look at the generational needs of Gen Z, or the different generations, it's kind of a generalized thing. But if you can target your recruiting to that, it's not so much the helicopters and all that stuff, which can be a part of it. There's no criticism of it, but it's really capturing all these things that appeal to people when they're coming in. And then also having a training program that identifies that, just like the doctor was saying too, and having some clear mentorship, because there's a lot of places, unfortunately, they just look at the recruiting and then they bring somebody on board, and then that's fire and forget. And then they're surprised when we have retention problems down the end. And if you look at recruiting as maybe a two-stage process, the recruiting and the retention, or however you want to look at that, because Tanya really hit a key thing with culture is, for example, our agency, we've been pretty blessed with pretty low turnover through my career here. Well, that's earned, right? You can't assume that you have that just automatically. And so you have to have those inward conversations about how do we adapt and change? And one of the things we did in hiring for years was, your ideal candidate was somebody that had done internships and it was so dedicated to our agency. And then you'd say, well, that's a lower risk of them leaving and all these good things. But you have to change your mindset to these folks. Like, for example, we had a candidate that said, oh, I want to be, a Fed. I've dreamed of being a Fed. And, kind of in the past, that would have been, a difficult thing to overcome, because it's like, hey, please do that. We support you. We don't want to invest time and money. But also, then we've started to realize that a lot of these younger generation don't know exactly what they want. But if they have that character and the qualities we want to be able to be a good representative, then that's on us, right, to retain that person and give them that experience through their career that they want to stay and they don't want to go somewhere. And I think that's important. So other things we've done is military is we have an education standard, but we've looked at a waiver for part of their military or part of their 60 credit hours based on some service in the military. And that seemed to be, certainly a good technique. And then the other thing that we do is we try to put as much money in people's pockets as possible in the initial pay. Like we people go to top pay within about 2 to 3 years. So instead of that whole, you look at a recruiting poster and yeah, it looks like a great salary, but you don't get there in 25 years. I think people see through that. And so I think if you can just be as transparent as possible and say, hey, this is your pay. Obviously we negotiate for raises every year, but that's what you're actually going to achieve. And I think making it simple has always been something I've tried to do with our recruiting program, to be straightforward with that. So that's kind of a few things. I mean, we have more specifics we can talk about, but I think connecting with people is the best thing. And the last thing is, what's so important is your officers and your professional staff, right? Because those truly are your recruiters. You probably hear this, but it's not a cliche. It is true. If you do surveys, whatever, of your hires, your good hires, and you see how they came in your organization, generally it's going to be from a contact with somebody in that organization. And that right there is the key. So if you're taking care of your officers, getting them, the information they need, the recruiting cards, all those things to empower them to take it to the next step with your recruiting team.
Thank you. Dr. Tyler, I'll turn to you and then we can, I see a good question in the chat that we'll follow up with shortly. But Jenna, it's the new year, it's January, and some agencies may be looking to reevaluate their recruiting efforts. Because what are some first steps agencies could take to evaluate their efforts in this new year?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would, coming at it from a research and a program evaluation lens, very much like the first step that I would recommend agencies take is to really clearly articulate how their recruitment strategies are designed to work. And kind of going back to what Mike and Tanya have said, right? Like context matters. Things that are working in your agency might look different in another agency. So I think really clearly articulating how, what you're doing and what outcomes you're, intended to achieve. And so to do this, I would really recommend that agencies leverage a simple yet a really effective program evaluation tool. And that includes developing a logic model. So a logic model, to give you a very brief and high level kind of overview of what those are, for those who may not be familiar, they really visually demonstrate why logically an agency would expect their recruitment innovations to produce their desired results. And so the key components of a logic model include inputs, which are going to really reflect the resources that are required to implement a recruitment or retention strategy. So think things like staff, funding, time. The second main component of it is activities. And these are the specific things your agency is doing to improve recruitment. So things like sending personalized messages or establishing social media campaigns or some of the great initiatives that Mike was just mentioning. Outputs are things that really reflect the accomplishment of those activities. We think about these as generally being quantifiable. So how many personalized messages, how many contacts did you have with applicants? And then finally, outcomes represent the changes an agency expects to experience in the short, the intermediate, and the long term. So this could include things, obviously like having more qualified applicants or reducing the time from application to offer, or, really the long-term one, of having better officers on the streets. So from there, agencies can really use their logic model to identify what to evaluate, what information to collect, and how to collect it. And by grounding recruitment and retention efforts in a clear logic model, agencies can help build a really solid foundation for future assessment and evaluation to, again, really understand what's driving the change.
Perfect. How can agencies really know if their recruiting efforts are successful, or is there some way to kind of, tally that metric?
Yeah, so I think agencies can know if their recruitment efforts are successful by really being clear about what success looks like and measuring it over time. So, as I just shared, it really begins with developing a logic model to define your outcomes rather than just relying on a single indicator such as application volume. And really, to strengthen this process, I would highly encourage agencies to consider collaborating with researchers who can provide that methodological and analytical expertise, right? Researchers can help agencies design evaluation approaches that can really help them, for their specific agency, generate credible evidence about whether and which specific recruitment activities are working and for whom they're working and under what conditions. And I think from an evaluation standpoint, we're always really interested in not finding out just what works, but what's not working or what, isn't working well enough that we want to continue to put resources into that.
Thank you for that. A few questions in the chat. One is, will the recording be available after the webinar? Yes, it will. Will be available on social media sites as well as our website. There's another question that anyone who's spent more than 5 minutes around police recruiting have heard the topics of hiring standards related to drug history, tattoos, and other things related to appearance in the profession. Really, to anyone who would like to answer, what are your thoughts on those and how that relates to recruiting, but how that may also have downstream impacts kind of in the profession, if any?
Well, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I can start, but then I'm going to turn to Mike. And, this is a tense topic, right? Because people don't want to lose quality applicants. And there's an assumption that when you change standards, that you're lowering standards. So first and foremost to me is the question of like, it depends on why and how agencies are changing standards. Like, what is the reason that you're doing that? And to be clear, I don't know that modernizing standards it shouldn't equate directly to lowering expectations or what you're looking for in an officer. It really means on like, what is the ideal officer in terms of their communication skills, what actually predicts safety and performance and trust. But people worry about changing standards because they think it means they're cutting corners. So why is it that you're doing that is how I would start that conversation. Mike, I'll turn it to you.
No, that's certainly spot on. The thing with standards is fascinating. Of course, being in Colorado, we were kind of at the tip of the spear with some of the marijuana conversations in law enforcement, and of course, Canada now has legalized basically so policing. So it's interesting to watch different states or regions, but just like Tanya was saying, it's in kind of getting back to the conversation with folks you're trying to recruit, is really evolving and not being afraid to look at things, right? It doesn't always have to be a decision to change something, but we have to look at those things and have that honest conversation about that, because standards really, I mean, of course we have different levels of standards. Most of us has state standards that you have to meet to be a police officer or certain professional staff, but then you have your community standards, and that's where you really have to make sure that with your agency and your community that you're reflecting things that are just like marijuana. I used to be very active in the drug units and stuff like that, right? So, my thinking has evolved over the years as I see things and as I recruit, but we have to not be afraid to look at, like, for example, marijuana standard is what is the actual effect and what is our standard identifying? Like when you have like a 1 year standard for marijuana, is that your intent? It's risk management is really the base of it. But if you have a good candidate that has, used marijuana 3 months ago and they're like, it just wasn't for me, so on and so forth, is that somebody you're really trying to screen versus their totality of their character and their decision making versus, somebody maybe that had terrible decision making until a year before. And then, so I think, obviously you want to be, you want to have standards because you do want to be fair to people and not just pick and choose everything. So I'm not advocating that, but there are discretionary standards where you can look at that. If you're afraid to have that conversation, I see this with weed all the time when I talk around the country and talk to different agencies. Some of them is like, yep, the chief's like, no way, no how, 5 year, you're not going to smoke weed. Well, let's really look at what society is doing as we go. The other key things are education standards, because there's a lot of resistance to change in that. And just like we did, we took apart, we didn't get rid of our whole education standard, but we did do some waivers and things like that. And then the other thing is, things like tattoos, visible tattoos. I had an interesting meeting. We had changed our tattoo policy a while back, officer initiated, to visible tattoos, that were approved on the arm, basically. And my deputy chief, we were meeting, and he was a little bit, hesitant at first when this went down. He's pretty straightforward. And he said, I thought we could get all kinds of complaints for the community. He's like, I don't remember, I don't recall a single complaint now. And part of that's just that mindset, right? You don't want things that are offensive or things like that, but it's just different. And so I think, so that's some of the things we've just really tried to do is look thoughtfully at these things. But to Tanya's point is you're always going to have internal pushback. And I think that's where your leadership is so important. So when they tell the story and support that, it's transparent and why that is and why this is not that big of a deal in that change. But if you're changing, standard, that's clearly like, well, we're going to allow people that lie, in our agency. Well, that's a lowering of standards. I'm sorry. There's no way around it, right? But if you're going to allow somebody to have a tattoo, okay, well, as long as your community, your agency can deal with that, I think those are things you need to look at.
Yeah, and I would just really echo what Mike was saying there in terms of, thinking about the community that you serve and how, the community characteristics have changed over the years. And, we were talking about the different, the differences between the different generations and what that looks like. And kind of going back to what Mike was just saying too, I think messaging is a clear aspect of it as well, in terms of you're not lowering your standards, you are modernizing, you're changing them to make them better, to hopefully, achieve higher and better quality officers on the street to improve your community. So I do think, the messaging aspect of it is such a key part.
One last thing I would add to that too, and great conversation so far, is the idea that that standard changes as you continue in your career. So a lot of people it gets very complicated when you talk about physical fitness standards. So we talk about the standards that you need to join the law enforcement profession. But one of the things that I don't see is a lot of agencies that require you to maintain those standards throughout your career. So what incentives are you putting in place to ensure, in this particular instance, that your force is staying physically healthy? And then that's an expectation. You could make the same argument for marijuana use and a number of other things, but what are the expectations for joining versus the expectations for staying on the job? And Mike, I don't know if you want to add to that, and then William's probably going to get us back on track.
Yeah, just briefly, this is a great conversation. But with physical agility tests, for entry, those are rooted in the 60s, and so you have mostly military people. So a lot of them were framed for 6'2" males, right? And that was the vision of then, what a police officer was. And a lot of places have continued with that mindset. Some of it discriminatory focus, but some of it just like, well, that's just the way it should be. You should be able to do, all these things. And as the job, one of the things that we have now is so much technology. right? That, taser 10s and you name it, drones, all this stuff like that. You still have to have physical abilities to safely be a police officer. Nobody's arguing that. But you can't just say, well, it's always been like this and we'll just always keep it that way. Well, because then you're potentially excluding people that would be great officers because maybe they're not 6'2" or whatever your testing is. So I think that's a huge thing. But that right there, and we've looked at ours, and we're looking at ours. But you do get a lot of pushback from people that want to make sure that our standards are good, and we're not lowering standards. For example, our female officers on the fitness team, they're some of the most vocal, quite frankly, about looking at it because they want to make sure we're not lowering the standards. And that's really not the conversation. It's what the best way to approach this, so that we truly are identifying those core needs that we need to have anybody be a police officer.
It's amazing. We've talked a decent amount about recruiting, but let's look at the other side of the same coin at retention and keeping the officers that we currently have. Mike, recruiting is important and retention is just as critical, but why are officers leaving? And when does that usually happen in their careers? And what can we kind of do to frame that conversation?
Well, a couple things, and I'll share a little bit of our agency perspective, and then, of course, perspective from others that are around or people I talk with. But, we've been pretty blessed with some pretty good retention, but the people that leave our agency tend not to go to other agencies. It tends to be a switch in profession, real estate, different things like that. And I think those are a couple things to track when, with your agency. Are you losing people to surrounding agencies? And of course, then you can diagnose why, and maybe you can address some of those things, whether it's culture, pay, whatever. But then there's also, the people in this generation, just like we were talking about, that are only going to stay for a set amount of years, and then something else to draw them. It's easy to say, like when I say, well, most people don't leave our agency for other agencies, easy to say, well, yeah, then we're doing great, right? Well, no, you still have to identify if somebody's going to be a real estate agent. Was there something we could have done to keep them as a police officer in our agency? It's not always just, well, I'm done being a cop, I'm going to move. So I think those are, some of the key things to, when we talk about exit interviews or things like that, but certainly as an agency, we need to make sure that, hey, if somebody's going to leave, let's do that. The other thing is training opportunities, things like that. Like, we've got a ton of special units in our agency, which is good, but also, you want to have a realistic expectation for folks of what that career path is, kind of like Tanya was saying early. So what is that journey? And then the last thing I'll say is, when you bring people in the agency, what is your training program? Are you continuing to mentor people? Are you continuing to build people? Do you have your own academy? If so, are you setting, the standards and expectations for what you want? If you're sending them to other academies, do you do a good job when they come back to make sure that your culture is ingrained in these officers, to set them up for this? So, there's so many things, mentorship programs, you name it. But I think that and the last thing I'll say about this is there are factors we don't control. And in nationwide, like we saw after George Floyd, and like way back to different things throughout. Like when I started about 33 years ago, it wasn't that long after Rodney King incident. So there's always some big things which kind of can affect the national narrative. And so we certainly saw a downturn in applications, after George Floyd, and our state did a lot of change to legislation, which not everything, was received by people the same way. So, it's a conversation of talking folks through that. But what we saw was a lot of people that just didn't want to come to the profession. And then we had an element of people that were leaving the profession just because they felt like they were doing the right thing, but there was a lot of things in place to potentially, prosecute them or things like that. And those are difficult, right? Because that training piece, you're training people the best you can, but you can't always control somebody's look at, social media or kind of the narrative that might be going around that.
Thank you for that perspective. Uh, Jenna, what does the research tell us about some of the biggest drivers for retaining our current law enforcement officers?
Yeah, so I think Mike hit on a lot of these, and unfortunately, the empirical research on what really works to retain officers is quite limited. However, a team of researchers at RTI International just recently conducted a broad review of the literature that not only included police-specific kind of strategies, but also just broader workforce research in general. And I think one of the biggest things that really emerged from that study, one of the biggest drivers, is really compensation and other financial incentives. I think that's always going to remain a driver, but other retention strategies in the literature that really, align with what Mike was just saying, include things like mentorship and training opportunities, ensuring that, newer officers have really great supervisory support and that individuals that are overseeing those officers, want to be there and have the skills and the leadership capabilities to really, oversee those individuals. Another thing that has really been emerging is the idea of a procedurally fair workplace and employing bottom-up decision making to account for more voices from different levels of the agency. I think that's especially true, right, in today's environment, and kind of those generational differences that we were talking about. And then a large, growing body of literature is really considering some of the wellness initiatives that Mike has talked about to, build officer resilience and prevent, fatigue and burnout, which could, not maybe cause them to go to a different agency, but to leave the profession altogether.
That touches on something I want to kind of, you know, pull a little bit from the Q&A section as well as some other places. What do you see as the role of mentorship as well as leadership training and promotional opportunity as a tool to retain kind of high achieving employees? Just wanted to pose that to any and everyone.
Mike, I was expecting you to
Oh,
go
yeah.
first.
No. So I'm happy to. Yeah. So I think that is huge. It's like the Gallup poll, the Q14 or something that do you have a friend at work? It's your one of the signs of the fact that you're probably going to stay. I think those are so huge for because we all look at supervisors that have affected us and leaders that have affected us, and making sure that we have that communication. So whether your organizational culture is already like that and you can continue to build that, or if you really need to affect culture by doing a formalized mentorship program or things like that, that are really going to help that. Because promotion, I mean, that's a huge thing, because you have to, number one, you have to have a promotional process in your agency that is fair, achievable, and transparent, so people that they can prepare. And but then that's on as leadership as well, and agencies to really reach out and help people along that journey, as we were helped ourselves, and keep paying that back. But I think the other thing is FTOs, our field training program. I think that is where we're growing our future leaders for an agency. You have people that generally are stepping up and really taking on that role. So then we need to make sure we're mentoring that cadre, providing them training. And, for example, we brought, Ben Heyman out for our FTO retreat last year, I guess, to continue the challenge with some different, outside training and leadership concepts, not just the nuts and bolts of here's how you do a DOR or here's how you handle things like that. So I think that's an important thing to look at as you kind of build those avenues of opportunity for people. And the last thing I'll just say, and I'll turn it over, is, are you being realistic as well, having that truthful conversation about whatever your promotional thing looks like and opportunities. Sometimes it is going to take a little bit longer than people think, and I think it's a little bit easier to do. But also it just goes back to that training thing, like patrol. If they want to be a detective, well, breaking it down, there's so many things you're doing. It's giving people opportunity, because leadership is not a title. I mean, it's cliche, but it's true. And are you giving people opportunity to do that as they go?
Amazing.
I'll just add on that quickly, William. I think mentorship is really important, especially at different times in your career, whether that's recruits or later on as you're preparing for different roles. And it can be especially relevant for particular underrepresented groups. So I think mentorship is something that agencies really have to think about what that looks for like. And it doesn't necessarily have to be within your agency, right? Sometimes you find mentors on the outside that are equally as important. To add one thing to what Mike said is, if you look at leadership development, and I agree, leadership to me is behavior more than anything else. And you look around at different police departments, there is plenty of in-service training. There's training that you might get when you get promoted for sergeants, lieutenants, captains, but that is different than what we're talking about here in terms of professional development and leadership development. That's not necessarily what an agency is giving you. What they're pushing you to is different programs that are out there. UVA has an excellent one. So do others that are really helping you develop in different ways that the agency is not offering you. And I think that system, if you think about the entirety of the profession, is very fractured, and there's not enough emphasis on that. And lastly, Mike, thinking about your role as a sergeant, I don't think there's enough emphasis, I can't speak today, sorry, on frontline supervisors and sergeants and lieutenants and the roles that they play.
Well, yeah, it just a quick add to that is, like, if you do look at like exit interviews for people that leave or question, it's like people leave because of that frontline person. They may complain about the chief or sheriff or whatever, but really, if they have a good first line supervisor, they can weather that storm, And yeah, no, I completely agree with that.
That's awesome. Tanya, you touched on it just a little bit, but wanted to see if we could just dive a little bit further to view retention as a workforce perspective, a kind of a talent management issue rather than solely a policing issue. Just want to see if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, and a couple of points I would make that Jenna and Mike have both touched on, but retention is shaped by the daily experience inside an organization. And secondly, Mike touched on this, recruiting and retention to me they're not separate issues. What brings people in affects whether they stay, and what drives people out affects who applies next, right? So I think it's really important to point on that. I did some work with RTI, Jenna, as a follow-up to some of that work, specifically on exit interviews. And one of the things that came out of that is that many agencies do collect exit interview data, but they don't use it to guide change. So they are collecting this information like we often do with employee surveys, but they're not actually doing anything with it, which is complicated in many ways. And to kind of think about your question, William, other fields assume that careers change over time, right? Policing often assumes that people are either pushing through or they're leaving. So departments that do better, in thinking about analogous industries in particular, often plan better for change instead of treating it as a failure. And that starts with the attention that leadership is paying to the challenge. Is it a surprise every time someone leaves, or are they paying attention to it along the way? So a couple of ideas that I would borrow from other fields would be really structured early support. We touched on that a little bit. Very clear roles and pathways and how you get there in terms of transparency and fairness. And then perhaps there's some short-term adjustments in the case of what you can do to help some officers stay instead of leave. So if you think about stay interviews and really keeping the pulse on that. And a conversation that comes up often in policing is about flexibility. So recognizing that you need to be more flexible with some things that are really hard in policing, like tours and schedules and flexibility tied to experience and performance. So in the last thing I would say is when I take all of this into consideration, going back to it's not about lowering standards. It's about changing expectations and meeting employees where they are so that they want to stay in the job longer.
That's awesome. We're rounding the last about 8 minutes here. Wanted to do two kind of round robin questions to all the panelists. I'll let you all sort out the order however you see fit or fight for that one. If departments could change one thing to improve recruiting and retention, what should it be?
Well, I would just jump out, I guess, and say, kind of like we've been saying, it's really to look inwardly at, are we walking the walk that we want people to do? It's like picking your recruiters, right? You better be picking recruiters that have the qualities that you are looking for in people. You know, the recruiters that are going to be a recruiting event and sitting at a table, arms crossed, you know, obviously ordered to be there. You know, that's not how you get attract the people. So it's acting like you want the people to come to you. And that's, and I give a lot of credit to my chief and organization, because we hear a lot of recruits coming in say they're attracted by the overall engagement with the community. And you can't fake that, right? We're not perfect, but that's what our chief and expects from people. So it's not just a recruiting mission, it's an organizational mission. And I think that's probably the biggest thing. If you can connect those, one of my favorite things to say to potential recruits is, when we hire you in a year, you're not going to come to me and say, this is not what you described. This is something different. And I think that's huge, because people want a sense of belonging. Good people. All right. That's how you attract people. We're all the same, right? No matter our backgrounds, you want to feel like you belong somewhere. And if you have an organization that is actually someplace people want to come, that's how you'd be successful. All the other things are part of it. But if you don't have that sense of belonging, well, good luck.
Thanks, Mike. Jenna.
Yeah, I think, coming at it from a research perspective, I would definitely say, the one thing I would really encourage agencies to do is to start really tracking what they're doing, and with the goal to actually use that data. And I think, that hits on what Tanya was just saying. Many agencies are investing significant time and resources into their recruitment and retention efforts, but they're probably not systematically documenting those efforts effectively, or they're not always documenting those efforts effectively. And, without proper tracking, it's, again, really hard to know what's working, what's not working, where do we want to put our time and resources into.
Well, what I would add is, I touched on this just a minute ago, but leaders in particular need to pay attention early, and they need to act when their people raise concerns. This is a long game. This is, should not be thought of as a short-term fix. I think the challenges that we're facing now in the profession with recruitment and retention are not going away anytime soon. And then lastly, I touched on this a little bit with supervisors, and my husband was a sergeant, so I'm very familiar with this aspect. But you need to listen to your frontline supervisors. They often know how officers are feeling long before anyone else does, and before it shows up in other places. I see you smiling, Mike.
Yes, that's so true, so true.
Just kind of last closing thoughts. See if we can do a kind of reverse order, starting with you, Tanya. Just what gives you optimism about the future recruiting and retention in law enforcement?
Yeah, so it's going to be kind of very connected to what I just said. So when I think there's a lot of people out there right now, and leaders in particular, who are paying attention. They are thinking about their organizational health of the agency they work for. And I think they're more focused on their people. Not to say that they haven't been in the past, but I think with the past decade and focus on officer safety and wellness in particular, I think that's been more of a concern for leaders in particular. And I am bit optimistic because I think some people are less focused on just reacting when someone leaves and then really thinking about the reason why. So I definitely think there's optimism. There are many reasons to be optimistic about what the future of this looks like for the workforce that is serving all of these communities.
Thank you. Jenna?
Yeah, I think what gives me optimism is that, conversations like this are happening more and more frequently. I think also, increased attention to these challenges, making them more visible, can really elevate them as legitimate areas of study rather than just kind of being background noise at times. And, as recruiting and retention become more clearly defined research problems, problems that, we need better evidence to solve, more funders, more agencies might be able to dedicate more time to build that evidence.
Mike?
Yeah, I think things like the restoring the ranks, conversation just to that research, that evidence, because it's so easy, to think, oh, that these are what we need to fix or throw out there to appeal. But I think it's important to have that. The other thing that gives me optimism is, 33 years now, you see all the change, but guess what? At the end of the day, you see people coming in wanting to do this job, having so many tools maybe than we did when we started, or more tools to really serve, protect, and things like that. And it struck, I'd mentioned earlier some of the maybe legislative changes that have quite frankly slowed down some recruitment in some states. But what we noticed is when some of that happened here a few years back in Colorado, there was, with our in-service training groups, there was a little bit more, it was a little bit tougher for them because they're like, well, we do this stuff, and now there's all these laws basically trying to get us, right? But then we noticed our academy classes, we have our own academy, they come in and they don't know anything different. And they're just like, oh, we got to, do these things. So it just change, and it's not negative towards people that have been around. It just shows that continued growth, right? As people come into this profession, because that's our future, right? And those are the people that are going to be, having these conversations in the future, as we continue to do this job that is so important.
Awesome. Well, we're rounding the hour now. The Center for Public Safety and Justice here at the University of Virginia. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you to the panelists, Mike, Tanya, and Jenna. Thank you for your insight and experiences. As I've gotten to know all of you, you guys are very deep in this conversation. So I knew you guys would be great for this. And for our audience, thank you for the engaging conversation and questions, and thank you for joining us. Recruiting and retention challenges are complex, but discussions like this help us move toward practical, sustainable solutions. We will have 11 other speaking series with the center this year. We will have more on the February one coming shortly. But thank you all for your time this afternoon, and be safe.